Causes of oppression and genocide. If you say the word genocide, people usually think about the Holocaust. However, there's another genocide that most people don't consider, and that's the genocide towards the Indigenous people. There were many different genocides in Canadian history towards the Indigenous people, but for simplicity, I'm going to be looking at residential schools specifically and explaining how it fits into each of the 8 stages of genocide. Classification. There was a whole idea of the Europeans versus the Indians. The Indigenous people were classified as bloodthirsty savages who needed to be saved by the Catholics. Symbolization. The interesting thing about the residential schools is that this stage was the opposite than most genocides. Instead of making them identify themselves, they were forced to assimilate and restricted their culture. Dehumanization. Indigenous people were often called savages by the churches in an attempt to dehumanize and rationalize their children being taken away. The rationale was that they were saving the children by killing the Indian out of the child. Organization. Native children were forcibly removed from their homes and were taken to remote locations far away from their families. They were forced to attend schools that were designed to strip them of their culture. These schools were run by the Catholic churches with the help of the federal government. Polarization. There wasn't really much of a middle area to silence because so many Indigenous people were pushed away to the outskirts of society. If the abuse towards the Indigenous people is unknown by the general public, then there's not really a middle ground to vouch for them. Preparation. Once the schools were created, children were taken by force away from their families. Siblings were often separated as well once they got to the schools in order to weaken any family ties. In the year 1920, it became illegal for an Indigenous person to attend any other school that wasn't a residential school. Extermination. Even though they weren't rounded up into gas chambers or shot, there was still an attempt at extermination. Instead of being killed, the idea behind the schools was to kill the Indian and the child. If they spoke their native language, they would be punished. The children were taught to associate pain and suffering with their culture. Many were also sexually and physically abused by the churches. Many survivors either turned to alcohol later in life to cope, or ended their life altogether because of how badly abused they were at these schools. Even to this day, suicide rates for Indigenous people are much higher than for the average population. Denial. The Canadian government didn't give out an official apology to Indigenous communities until 2008. Despite this apology, they still have yet to classify it as a genocide. One way of downplaying a genocide is by not classifying or calling something a genocide. Conclusion. When most people think of the genocide against the Indigenous people, they think of what happened hundreds of years ago when the English and French first came to North America. When talking about it, most people's go-to response is, well, that was hundreds of years ago. Nobody alive today had any part in what happened. Another thing I noticed, especially in the older generations, is that they usually seem really surprised when you mention that the residential schools ended in 1996. Even if they know of the whole 60s scoop and the horror of that, they tend to think of residential schools as a whole as something that happened in that time frame, not as a thing that ended 24 years ago. It's getting better with the younger generations. It's now being taught in schools. I think the only way to overcome this dark part in Canada's history is by talking about it and listening to the survivors and their families.